One play, that's all it took. One Saturday night in August to blow up the entire WNBA season and drag a national conversation about race, accountability, and power straight into the middle of a basketball court. And here's the thing. It didn't spiral because the foul was unprecedented. It didn't spiral because the ejection was controversial. It spiraled because of two words posted on the internet minutes after it happened. Two words with no context, no explanation, and a tag attached that basically lit a match and threw it into a room full of gasoline. By Sunday morning, this wasn't a sports story anymore. It was everywhere. National news sites, opinion columns, cable talk shows, all of them chewing on the same question. How does a basketball foul turn into a proxy war for one of the most loaded debates in American culture? And more importantly, what did the league responsible for all of this actually do about it? The answer to that last question is where it gets uncomfortable. And it's why people are still talking about this. Because what the WNBA did, or more accurately, what it didn't do, might end up being the biggest story of all. Here's everything that actually happened, in the order it actually happened, because a lot of the coverage got pieces of this wrong, and the full picture is more complicated and more revealing than any single angle you've already seen. August 8th, 2026. Indiana Fever on the road at the United Center in Chicago, taking on the Sky in a nationally televised matchup. First quarter, the kind of game that draws attention before the opening tip because of who's playing in it. The Fever have been the most watched team in the league all season. Every road game they play draws a packed building and a national broadcast audience, and that means every single possession gets dissected online before the final buzzer even sounds. It's the kind of microscope that changes the energy in an arena. Players know the footage is going everywhere. Coaches know every call gets reviewed 100 times by morning. So the first quarter is already frantic. Both teams playing with that tight, high-stakes energy that comes with knowing millions of people are watching in real time. Sophie Cunningham gets the ball in transition. She's got a step on the defense. She rises for what should have been a clean, fast-break layup. The kind of straightforward, uncontested finish that doesn't usually get a second thought. What happened next wasn't straightforward at all. DiJonai Carrington comes from behind and catches Cunningham across the head and neck. The hit is hard enough to knock her sideways in midair. Somehow, the shot still drops through the net. Cunningham's body does not land nearly as clean. She hits the hardwood with force, and for a moment, the entire United Center just goes still. The kind of quiet a crowd gets right before it decides exactly how loud it's about to be. Officials stop play immediately and go to the monitor. This isn't a situation where refs shrug and move on. This is a full review, frame by frame, every available camera angle. Because what they just watched with their own eyes already looked like more than a standard foul. When they come back, the call is upgraded, flagrant foul 2. The officiating crew's own explanation laid it out plainly. Wind up, impact, and follow through high across the neck. That combination, the full sequence of motion, not just the contact itself, is exactly what the rulebook defines as excessive and unnecessary. It's not a close call. It's not a judgment that could have gone the other way on a different night with different refs. The combination of factors the league uses to separate a hard foul from a flagrant one are all present clearly in the replay. Flagrant 2 means one thing automatically: ejection. Carrington is out of the game. But Cunningham isn't staying on the floor either. She pops up almost immediately, and the fury on her face is visible from the upper deck. She moves toward Carrington, gets in her space, and there's a shove before both benches and the officiating crew step in to keep things from escalating into something much uglier than a flagrant foul and an ejection. Indiana holds on to win the game 90-86. In any normal week, that's the entire story. A road win in a hostile building, another data point in a Fever season that's already rewritten the league's viewership numbers.
But this wasn't a normal week. And within minutes of the final buzzer, the real story wasn't the score anymore. Here's a piece of context that got buried in a lot of the early coverage, and it matters more than almost anything else that happened that night. This wasn't Carrington's first flagrant foul this season. It wasn't even her second. Earlier in the year, she was assessed a flagrant for a hit to the head of Minnesota's Jessica Shepard in the season opener. A second one came later in the season after contact with Seattle's Skylar Diggins-Smith. Again, high contact, head area, flagrant. 2 flagrant fouls on 2 different opponents in 2 different games before August even started. A pattern that was already being discussed among analysts and fans who follow the league closely, even before this incident ever happened. Now think about the position the officiating crew was actually in on August 8th. They're not just grading one play in isolation on a random Tuesday. They're grading it inside a full season of context, a season where this exact player has already been flagged twice for the same category of high-contact, high-risk play. A third flagrant on a nationally televised game against a player already known league-wide as someone who isn't going to let a hard foul slide without a reaction, that's not a coin flip for the review team. That's about as close to an obvious call as this league gets. And yet, in the first wave of social media reaction, that history barely got mentioned. The narrative formed fast, and it formed loud, and a lot of it left out the part where Carrington had already been here twice before in the same season. That omission shaped everything that came next because it let the conversation skip straight past the basketball to the 2 words Carrington posted minutes after leaving the court. Which brings us to Cunningham and the response she gave that honestly nobody was expecting. If the league expected Sophie Cunningham to downplay what happened, to give the standard non-answer that post-game pressers usually produce, she did not cooperate. Speaking to reporters after the game, Cunningham didn't hesitate when asked whether she thought the foul was intentional. She said clearly that she felt it was unnecessary, that she had no existing beef with Carrington, and that she had no intention of just absorbing a hit like that without reacting. Her exact words, "I popped up. I'm not going to let anyone just do that to me. I think everyone knows that." Then she said something that most coverage treated as a footnote, but that actually landed harder than anything else she said that night. When asked directly about the white privilege post Carrington had already put up, the post that was already spreading on social media while Cunningham was still in the locker room, she didn't dodge it. She said, "This has nothing to do with race. Last year I did the same thing and I got kicked out, and I deserve to be kicked out. There's no reason even to play that card." That last year comment wasn't throwaway. It wasn't something she dug up to win an argument. It was a real receipt. Cunningham herself was ejected for a flagrant foul during a physical game back in 2025, part of the same reputation she's built in Indiana as the player who plays right up to the edge of the rule book and doesn't apologize for it. By bringing that up unprompted, she wasn't just pushing back on the race framing in the abstract. She was pointing directly at her own history and daring anyone watching to explain why the standards should be different this time. The composure she showed doing it is what people in that press room kept talking about afterward. No deflection, no waiting for a team statement to speak for her, no careful, coached non-answer. She answered the basketball question and the much harder cultural question in the same breath, back to back, without missing a beat. In a league where post-game availability often turns into a parade of carefully worded nothing, that kind of directness stands out. And it stood out even more because of what she was responding to, a post that had already changed the entire shape of the conversation before she even reached the microphone. Minutes after her ejection, DiJonai Carrington opened her phone and posted 2 words on Threads, tagging the Indiana Fever directly: white privilege. No context, no sentence attached to it, no explanation of what she meant or what she was referring to, just 2 words and a tag, sent out into a sports internet that was already replaying her foul on a loop. The reaction was immediate, and it split almost entirely down predictable lines.
Some pointed to Carrington's academic background. She studied African and African American studies at Stanford,
and her defenders argued she was reaching towards something larger than one basketball play, a systemic point about how physical fouls get judged differently depending on who's throwing them and who's absorbing them. That the ejection wasn't the issue, but the broader pattern behind decisions like it was worth raising. Others called the post flat-out reckless. The argument on that side was straightforward. You cannot turn a clean officiating decision, one that was reviewed frame by frame and upgraded on its merits by a crew that has no obvious motivation to favor one player over another, into a racial flashpoint minutes after hitting an opponent in the head and neck. Whatever the academic argument behind the phrase, attaching it to this specific play on this specific night with no explanation was always going to be received as a direct accusation, regardless of intent. Both coaches weighed in, and they did not agree. Fever head coach Stephanie White said she believed the call was correct, while also not believing Carrington intended to hurt Cunningham. That's a careful, measured answer, agreeing the ejection was right while extending the benefit of the doubt on intent. It satisfies almost nobody looking for a clean villain, which is probably exactly why she said it. Sky head coach Tyler Marsh took a different read entirely, saying that live, without seeing the replay, he thought Carrington was just making a play on the ball. 2 days later, after the footage had been broken down from every angle available, Marsh hadn't shifted much. He continued to defend his player's intent and pushed back on what he described as inconsistent officiating. He also acknowledged something else, choosing his words carefully, that there was significant vitriol directed at Carrington, and that when the league talks about protecting players, that protection should extend to every player, not just the ones on one side of a controversy. By Sunday morning, the story had already jumped from sports pages onto general news and opinion sections, the kind of crossover that only happens when a basketball incident taps into something bigger than the sport itself. Columnists who hadn't written a word about the WNBA all season were suddenly filing hot takes. Cable news panels were breaking down a Threads post the same way they'd break down a Senate hearing. And the league, the organization actually responsible for setting the standard on all of this, had said almost nothing. So what did the WNBA actually do? Carrington was fined $1,000 in connection with the ejection and the post. That's confirmed. That's the total sum of the league's public response to a controversy that had been running on national television and dominating sports media for 48 hours straight. No suspension, no additional statement addressing the post directly, no public clarification of what standard the league applies when a player uses racially charged language to respond to an officiating decision that's already been reviewed and upheld. The clearest sign of how far that silence stretched came on Monday night when Carrington suited up and played normally in a game against the Seattle Storm, checking into the game with just over 5 minutes left in the first quarter, as if the previous 48 hours hadn't happened at all. Now here's where the comparison that's making league officials most uncomfortable comes in. Just weeks before this game, a co-owner of the Seattle Storm was suspended by the league and fined after confronting 2 teenage fans in a parking lot who were holding a sign in support of Cunningham's publicly stated position on transgender athletes in sports. That suspension came quickly. The league acted, made a statement, and the decision was covered as a demonstration of the WNBA taking conduct seriously. The contrast between that response speed and the silence following this incident is the thing most people in and around the league cannot stop talking about. One involves a team executive saying something to teenagers outside an arena. The other involves a nationally televised flagrant foul, an ejection, a racially charged social media post that spent 2 days as the dominant story across sports media, and a player back on the court 48 hours later with nothing more than a fine that most people didn't even know existed until reporters went looking for it. That's not a subtle inconsistency. That's a gap you can drive a truck through. And the timing made it worse. The WNBA commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, had sent a memo to teams just days before the Fever Sky game, acknowledging discussions around transgender athlete participation in the league were still ongoing. The league was already trying to manage one live wire. Dropping a race-charged flashpoint on top of that, and then going quiet, is not exactly a crisis communications strategy that inspires confidence.
2 days after the incident, Carrington tried to walk it back. She posted a longer explanation on social media, writing that she had never claimed the officiating decision itself was white privilege, and pushing back on what she described as a misreading of her post. She referenced her academic background pointedly as context for why she felt qualified to use the phrase at all. Whether that clarification landed the way she intended is its own separate argument. What isn't arguable is that it came 2 full days after the story had already formed, hardened, and been carried to every corner of sports media. The correction arrived after the narrative had already been written without it. That gap between what Carrington says she meant and what almost everyone reading 2 words with no context actually took from them is exactly why this story had the shelf life it did. Intent and reception are 2 different things, and no amount of clarification after the fact closes that distance entirely. With the WNBA staying quiet, the pressure didn't evaporate. It just moved to people with louder platforms and less patience for careful non-answers. Fox News columnist Joe Concha called for a season-long suspension for Carrington, framing the foul itself as deliberate and politically motivated and tying it directly to the backlash Cunningham has faced over her public comments about transgender athletes. Analyst Aaron Torres went even further in his criticism of the league's overall handling of the situation, saying bluntly that it might be time for Adam Silver to consider stepping in. Emmanuel Acho added his voice as well, publicly calling out Carrington's post and telling her directly that she cannot frame that foul as white privilege. Here's what actually needs to be said plainly about that pressure campaign. None of those calls for Silver to intervene mean Silver has done anything about this specific situation. He hasn't commented on the Cunningham-Carrington incident. He hasn't issued any statement tied to this controversy. His most recent public comments about the WNBA this year were about the league's finances, where he's previously acknowledged the NBA has absorbed significant annual losses to keep the WNBA operational, and a carefully neutral answer earlier this season about whether Commissioner Engelbert will keep her job beyond this year. On that last question, Silver's exact position was that he hadn't had those conversations with Engelbert about her future, even while praising the work she's done. That distinction matters because it explains precisely why so many people are pointing upward. The NBA isn't just a distant organizational cousin to the WNBA, it is the financial backbone. Roughly 40% of WNBA revenue flows through the NBA, by some public estimates tied to the league's revenue structure. Another fifth belongs to outside investors who came in through a capital raise a few years back. What remains gets split between teams and players. Silver himself has acknowledged publicly that the NBA has absorbed real financial losses year over year to keep the women's league running. When an organization is that financially entangled with another, and a controversy this loud plays out while the smaller league's front office goes silent, it is not a stretch for people to start asking whether the organization with the deeper pockets and the bigger microphone should be the one to break that silence, especially when the smaller league's growth is the thing that justifies the investment in the first place. And the growth has been real. The WNBA's franchise valuations, viewership numbers, and social media engagement have all climbed sharply over the past 2 seasons. Every Fever road game is close to a sellout. National broadcasts are up across the board. A massive chunk of the audience tuning in right now is brand new to the sport, pulled in by Caitlin Clark, by Cunningham, by exactly this kind of high-stakes, high-emotion basketball that makes people care about a league they weren't paying attention to 2 years ago. A bigger audience means a bigger spotlight on how the league handles moments like this one. And that spotlight right now is landing on a 4-digit fine and nearly 2 weeks of institutional silence. More at stake now more than ever, which is exactly why staying quiet carries more risk than it used to.
Here's the simplest version of what this entire story is really about.
Every single day that the WNBA doesn't clarify its own standard for the foul, for the post, for what handled actually means in a situation like this, is another day where columnists, analysts, fans, and critics get to fill that silence with their own version of events. Some of those versions are fair, some of them are clearly reaching, but the league doesn't get to decide which ones stick if it isn't willing to say anything itself. That's the actual risk here, not any single fine or suspension, not whether Carrington gets one more game on the bench or 20. The real risk is what happens when an institution stays quiet long enough that the story gets told entirely without it, and then has to live with whatever version of itself that story decided to create. Cunningham handled this with more composure and more clarity than anyone had a right to expect. She named her own history unprompted, drew a straight line from her 2025 ejection to this one, and dared anyone to explain the difference. She answered the basketball question and the cultural one in the same breath, and walked away from that podium having controlled the one part of this story she could actually control. Carrington's walkback came 2 days too late, not because her academic argument doesn't have a basis, it does, but because 2 words with no context tagged directly at the opposing team minutes after hitting their player in the head and neck will always be read as a direct accusation by everyone scrolling past it. That gap between intent and reception is not something a follow-up post can close after the damage is already done. The first version of a story is the one that travels furthest, and the first version here was 2 words and a tag. The league's $10,000 fine satisfied essentially no one, not the people who thought Carrington's conduct warranted a suspension, not the people who thought the fine itself was a way of quietly penalizing her for the post without ever explicitly saying so, not the journalists who had to report on it, not the fans who watched Carrington check back into a game 2 days later like nothing had happened. And now the question that's hanging over everything is whether the organization that runs this league has the stomach to do what its own moment requires. The WNBA is bigger than it's ever been. Its audience is newer and wider than it's ever been. And the standard it sets for how it handles a controversy like this one, race, intent, accountability, a hard foul and 2 words and a whole lot of silence, will be the thing that audience remembers. Wind up, impact, follow through. That's the officiating standard that ended Carrington's night on August 8th. The league used it to make the call on the court. The question now is whether it applies off-court too. Whether the build-up to this moment, the impact it's already had, and the follow-through that still hasn't come will eventually force a response that actually matches the size of the story. Because the story isn't waiting, and silence eventually becomes its own answer. Drop your take below. You already know where this is going. Hit like and subscribe so you're there when the league finally decides it has something to say.